The afternoon sun illuminated Washington, D.C. in a subtle way. The 27-year-old Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, was sleeping in her opulent apartment close to the White House. A little silver cross, a mark of faith from New Hampshire, glinted on the collar of her navy blue jacket. Got up. President Trump called Karoline abruptly, saying, "There's a religious case at the D.C. local court. A group of Christians are suing because they were banned from praying in public." His voice was urgent, making it impossible for her to think. Today, Karoline chose a more straightforward look for her flat, which showed her discipline documents neatly placed with business apparel that had been prepared in advance. Although she was accustomed to managing crises as Trump's spokesperson, this was different since it affected her personal religion. Blazer dressed a white shirt and black trousers, but she still wore the cross as normal. Karoline hurriedly got into her svelte black SUV and drove fast through the congested streets. The news was blaring on NPR, but she turned it off to concentrate on the unforeseen work at hand before jumping into the story comment section. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss the most recent events. Karoline Leavitt forced her way through the glass doors of the D.C. local court, entering a stuffy, tense room where the murmuring of the throng sounded like an off-key symphony members are waiting on little cases. As the clacking of keyboards from the clerk's corner blended with traffic infractions and contract disagreements, she looked at her watch. 2:53 p.m. The religious case hearing that Trump wanted her to keep a close eye on was just a few minutes away. Karoline picked a rough wooden chair in the center row, put her phone on, and took notes while sitting in her document bag. A middle-aged man wearing a t-shirt that read "I am King" was sitting a few seats away, tinkering with his phone to her right. The silver cross around her neck glinted in the fluorescent lights, but she was unaware that everyone was staring at her. The room wasn't big, but it felt oppressive because of its clutter. The wooden door behind the judge's bench swung open, and Judge Charles Hargrove emerged at 62. He carried a rigid demeanor with salt and pepper hair combed back, wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose, and a black robe pressed flat as if just ironed. The crowd fell silent as he sat, his cold, sharp eyes scanning the room. James Wilson, a tall black best friend with a stern face, shouted. The young woman, wearing an oversized necklace that gleamed, whispered to her lawyer Karoline, who frowned. "This is a court of law, not a place to flaunt your individuality," he said in a deep but cutting voice as Karoline stood there. The other person's phone still in hand, her eyes still scrutinizing Hargrove. He then pounded his gavel on the desk to signify the beginning of the session. Quickly, Hargrove started calling cases. For example, a man was fined $50 for parking in the wrong location, and there was no dispute. A lady made rent payments. A mild warning Karoline made notes after observing that have operated things like a machine that was cold but efficient. She then looked at the man wearing the "I am King" t-shirt when he stood to present a neighbor dispute. And Hargrove didn't mention his gaudy shirt. The woman with the large necklace was called up, and Karoline frowned once more. But something wasn't right. Then his eyes landed on her, and he stopped mid-sentence, his hand flipping through paper, his eyes narrowing behind wire-rimmed glasses, as if he recognized something. His voice was cold, but there was a hint of hesitation. Karoline looked up without surprise, and stood with natural composure while the crowd turned to watch her murmurs. Rising as a few others recognized her, he pointed at her neck with a cross and spoke in a stiff tone that didn't fit here, because the courtroom is a neutral setting and not a place to show off one's faith. No prohibited signs were shown on the walls as Karoline looked around. She answered in a clear and assured voice. "Here to observe a case for work, I'm Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary. This is a personal thing that is protected by the First Amendment and does not violate any laws. The courthouse is a neutral setting, not a place of worship," so Hargrove squinted his face and renewed his job. He then hammered his gavel once more, perhaps emphasizing his power. The bailiff, James Wilson, was standing close to the bench, leaning, his head to watch Mrs. Thompson, a middle-aged court clerk, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. He stopped typing and looked curiously at Karoline. The man in the T-shirt and the woman wearing the large necklace exchanged a whisper, both of them obviously shocked that Hargrove had missed them. The stood sisters. In her calm but firm voice, she added, "I have the right to wear it under the First Amendment," realizing quickly that Hargrove wasn't only aiming at her, but also the cross itself, a symbol he appeared to loathe. Hargrove abruptly interrupted her. "Please don't lecture me about the law." As the crowd held its breath, Karoline took a deep breath and stepped up to the defendant's stand. Her heels clicked softly on the DC local court's old wooden floor, and the room went silent. Everyone's eyes were on her, and the silver cross on her navy blazer collar glinted under the lights like a tiny flame while a storm approached. Judge Charles Hargrove sat with his head up, his eyes narrowing behind wire-rimmed glasses, his face flushed with rage. "Why are you here with that?" "Missile it," he said in a low, sharp voice. "I'm here on duty and have the right to wear it," she said, still holding her phone, in an obvious attempt to project an air of authority as a razor. Using her thumb to covertly activate the recording mode, the sound of Hargrove banging his gavel on the desk reverberated throughout the room. "I've witnessed many people like you believe that faith grants them the right to disturb others anywhere, but I say that's not permitted in my courtroom." He leaned forward, clutching the gavel tightly. "Are you aware that this conduct is unlawful?" The woman with the large necklace murmured to her employer, but her tiny cross was the issue. Karoline furrowed her brow and glanced swiftly around the room, noticing the man wearing the I Am King t-shirt sitting there unobserved. "Sir, I'm not disturbing anything," she said, her voice steady. "If there is a specific prohibition, I would like to see the written guideline, because I am here for work, and my wardrobe has no bearing on anyone." Hargrove grinned impassively and without humor. "I'm the rule here. You entered my courtroom disobeying the law, and now you're threatening to demand a document?" He struck the gavel so forcefully that Mrs. Thompson, an older man in the back row, shook his head and whispered to his neighbor, "That necklace over there is bigger. Why is no one saying anything?" The clerk paused typing and looked up in alarm as the crowd started to murmur. Wilson, James the bailiff, who had worked here for 15 years, stood close to the bench and cocked his head to watch. Hargrove's attention to Karoline was familiar to him. This was not the first time he had witnessed such bias. Knowing that a straightforward argument wouldn't persuade Hargrove, Karoline took a deep breath and decided to play the long game. "If I've broken a rule, I have the right to a clear explanation," Karoline said. Hargrove scoffed, plainly seeing her comments as a challenge explanation. "Here's your explanation," she added, her hand gently adjusting her phone to make sure the recording didn't stop. He struck the gavel a third time, and the audience gasped as the sound rang like a final verdict. "I'm finding you $500 for contempt of court." Miss Thompson's eyes were troubled as she looked up, paused over the keys with her fingers. $500, a young woman whispered to her friend, "just for a cross." The man wearing the I Am King t-shirt laughed a little but quickly stopped as Hargrove glared at him. "You'll pay today before you leave?" Hargrove continued, his tone like a lecture. "Maybe this fine will teach you to respect order. This isn't a church, Miss Leavitt, nor a stage for your performance." He leaned back smugly, as if he had just won an uncontested fight. Karoline stood. Her face flushed, and he gripped the gavel until his knuckles turned white. "Don't change the subject," he yelled. "You're the only one here bold enough to bring a religious symbol into my courtroom. That's the difference." Her sharp eyes remained fixed on Hargrove, sir. "I understand your ruling," she said, her voice even though it was laced with resolve. But I have the right to ask, why aren't the others in this room with printed shirts and large necklaces fine too? Karoline said nothing more, but her thoughts were clear, and she gave a small nod as though to confirm her suspicions. Hargave was not only prejudiced, he purposefully targeted Christians. Mrs. Thompson started typing again, but her fingers were shaking. In her 12 years as Hargrove's clerk, she had hardly ever seen him punished so severely for such a little infraction. James Wilson, who had seen Hargrove handle hundreds of cases, stood next to the bench with his arms crossed and looked at Karoline with a glimmer of pity. This attention to the young woman stood out. Despite the no-filming rule, the whispers in the crowd became louder, and some people even snuck out their phones. Karoline stood motionless with her phone in her hand, her thoughts racing. She understood that this wasn't merely a fine, but rather an opportunity to reveal something more significant. "Are you done, sir?" she questioned in a quiet but sharp voice. Hargrove scowled, taken aback by her poise, and said, "You'll pay, and I'll move on with the session." Karoline didn't sit, but instead she moved closer to the bench, resting her hand on its edge. Her eyes never left Hargrove. "I'll pay, but we're not done here," she said in a low, determined voice. AR grinned again, but this time it faltered a little. Karoline Leavitt remained steadfast at the defendant stand, her eyes fixed on Judge Charles. Hargrove, the silver cross on her navy blazer collar, gleamed like a silent challenge. With his face flushed crimson with triumph and his hands still holding the gavel, Hargave had just found her $500 for contempt of court. The throng in the D.C. local court held its breath as the whispers faded. The clerk, Miss Thompson, paused, typing, her agitated gaze flitting between Karoline and Hargrove. "Wilson, James." With his arms crossed and his head tilted, the bailiff appeared to be waiting for something larger. "Did you hear me when Hargrove broke the silence, Miss Leavitt?" He banged the gavel, signaling the end of the $500 payment today. Karoline didn't move, though, and she took a deep breath before placing her hand on the edge of the bench and saying, "Sir, before I sit, I need to clarify a few things for the record." Hargrove frowned, taken aback by her composure, and he snapped, but his voice wavered as if he could sense something coming. Karoline smiled slightly, not fearlessly, but with the assurance of someone in charge. She took a tiny, shiny gold card out of her document bag and held it up for everyone to see. "Her name is Karoline Leavitt." The crowd gasped. The man wearing the "I Am King" t-shirt gaped. The woman with the huge necklace whispered to her lawyer, and Judge Hargrove froze his hand on the gavel in midair. "However, you should know that I am more knowledgeable about the law than you may imagine. I am the White House press secretary under President Donald Trump." ARG mumbled, his voice trailing off. But Karoline stopped him in his tracks and moved closer to the platform, her voice reverberating throughout the room. "Your rules or your personal bias?" She gestured to her neck, indicating that her religious freedom is guaranteed by the First Amendment. "You find me guilty, but do you know what the law says? I'm here on the president's instructions to watch a religious case in which a group of Christians are litigating for the right to worship in public." Arrow's expression changed as he tried to argue. "This is my courtroom, and I don't need you to teach me the law." Karoline interrupted him, sounding more adamant than ever. "You're wrong, sir. The law isn't yours alone. Let me remind you of the 1993 Supreme Court decision in the Church of Lukumi Babalu, the city of Hia, which held that the Constitution is violated when religious symbols are banned without a valid reason. Do you have a valid reason, or is it just because you don't like it?" Despite the guidelines, the crowd became hushed, and several people took unauthorized phone pictures. Hargrave opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Mrs. Thompson hovered her fingers over the keys while holding her breath. "James." Wilson gave a small eye nod. Al Light had seen a lot of cases, but never had a defendant flip the script this quickly. Karoline pressed on her voice like a prepared speech. "And you found me $500 for contempt. But I have proof right here in this room." She pointed to the man wearing the I Am King t-shirt, who was wearing a shirt with a design that was obviously against the dress code, but you said nothing. She also pointed to the woman with the large necklace who was wearing gaudy jewelry, but you were silent. "The only thing that infuriated you, sir, was my cross, a Christian symbol." RG shook, his face turning from red to pale. "You're slandering me," he stuttered, his voice weak and unpersuasive. Karoline continued and held up her phone. "From the moment you called me till now, I've documented everything. You may locate me, okay, but this doesn't end here. I've also texted the White House office to report this injustice." Whispers broke out among the audience as someone yelled, "She's right." James Wilson abruptly stifled another clap, and the terrified grip for control light, "Miss." He shook the gavel feebly, his voice tremulous, but Karoline shook her head, her eyes unblinking. "No, sir. Withdrawing the fine because of who I am simply serves to further illustrate your incorrectness." The courtroom exploded, and I demand that you look over the last 6 months' worth of records to see all fines associated with religious symbols. I also suggest that court employees, including you, be required to complete First Amendment training. Yes, the older man at the rear was standing there clapping and shouting. A girl muttered, "Who is amazing?" Mrs. Thompson typed frantically, recording each word as her eyes glowed as though she was seeing history. With a subtle smile, James Wilson acknowledged that she was unique from the beginning. A.R. Gervais sagged in his chair, his face ashen, his hands shaking on the gavel, and he glanced at Karoline, seeing her for the first time as a fierce opponent rather than a defendant. "You think I'm simply a spokesperson?" Karoline added, "I've worked with President Trump through countless lawsuits from elections to policy. I taught myself law to defend him, and now I'm using it to defend myself and others. You just made a big mistake." Her voice was quiet, but powerful. "Hargrove, judge." She set her White House card down on the bench and took a step back, but she never took her eyes off him. Arg opened his mouth to speak, but he refrained since he realized he had insulted a legal genius as well as a wise person. The throng roared once more. With a smattering of applause, Mrs. Thompson typed more quickly than before, seemingly to capture the moment in time. With regard for Karoline in his eyes, James Wilson moved closer to the bench. Sitting there, ARG. Grove's power was eroding in front of everyone. Karoline remained motionless. The cross continued to shine, serving as both her victory flag and a symbol of faith. The clock read 3:30 p.m., but the air inside had suddenly exploded like a bomb. Karoline Leavitt stopped at the glass doors to check her phone as she left the D.C. local court, the late afternoon sun glinting off the silver cross on her navy blazer collar. Trump's advisor, Harrow Find Me for the Cross, received the recording and a brief message from the White House office. She handled it and knew that this was no longer just a personal matter, but rather an opportunity for Trump and conservatives to win big. The courtroom was still humming. Trembling, the older man in the back turned to his neighbor's speech. "Nobody has ever knocked out a judge so quickly," and a young woman whispering to her boyfriend that she is the White House press secretary is amazing, Mrs. Thompson. The clerk's hands were shaking as she absorbed what she had seen, so she quickly printed the session transcript, Wilson James. The bailiff took the phone from the courtroom and called a colleague. A young woman abruptly stopped talking. The news started to spread like wildfire through the parched grass in Hargrove. When Karoline's phone buzzed frantically, and she saw that X's Tari cross in court trend, she opened the app and saw the first tweet from someone at the scene. Judge fines White House press secretary $500 for wearing a cross. She fights back with the law, leaving him stunned. Cross appeared in court, and within 10 minutes hundreds of people commented asking, "Who is she?" One prominent conservative account tweeted evidence that the systems are biased against Christians. "Thanks, Karoline Leavitt." She smiled a little, aware that this wave was only getting started. At 4:00 p.m., President Trump jumped in and posted from his personal account. "A socialist judge was just taught a lesson by my incredible spokesperson Karoline Leavitt on religious freedom and legal genius that we will not allow them to stifle." Faith. Over 50,000 people retweeted the message in only 30 minutes. Conservative. Media outlets such as Fox News jumped on trending headlines. "When the White House press secretary competes against Judge Overcross, she wins." Trump's top advisor called Karoline and he said, "You did great. The president wants this." In the meantime, Charles Harrove sat by himself in his office, behind the bench, with his phone ringing constantly and the dim light creating shadows on his pale face. Amplified, prepared a statement. Hands shaking, he gripped a cold coffee mug while silencing D.C. Judicial Council media, including longtime colleagues. Not only had the altercation with Karoline embarrassed him in front of the audience, but it was also reverberating throughout the city. He mumbled, "She's just a young girl. How did this happen?" But he knew deep down that he had run into something larger than himself. Mrs. Thompson was unable to remain silent while at the courts, so she called a friend at a nearby newspaper in a forceful but quiet voice. "For the past 12 years that I've worked with Hargrove, he consistently targets religious symbols, particularly Christian ones like the girl today. I have records to prove that." She took a tiny notebook out of her drawer that included entries of similar situations in which people were advised about wearing Islamic emblems and fined significantly for crosses, yet slogan tees and gaudy jewelry were allowed. She knew she was taking a chance, but after today, she couldn't keep quiet. James Wilson also took action. In the courthouse break room, he met with co-workers and emotionally recapped the incident at least 20 times. Hargrove finds people wearing offensive t-shirts with religious iconography this year. A co-worker concurred and said, "I'll call the press because this needs to be out there by 5 p.m. He laughs it off and leaves it visible. A reporter from Channel 7 was outside the courthouse today shooting live. White House press secretary Karoline Leavitt received a $500 fine for wearing a cross in court, but she retaliated, and now the city is talking about the cross in court, with over 100,000 mentions. He gave me $200 for a prayer badge last year, and I witnessed him reprimand a mother for wearing a cross during a divorce proceeding." A large account published a little video. Someone discreetly recorded Karoline in court when she held out her White House card, her voice booming loudly. The video quickly went viral, receiving 1 million views in a matter of hours. Karoline was watching the story unfold from her car parked on a quiet street corner when she contacted her husband, a quiet businessman. Her voice was calm but thrilled. "Honey, I just shut down a judge. This is going to get huge." He laughed on the phone. She nodded, hung up, and opened an email from Trump's office preparing for a press conference tonight. "We're turning this into a victory at home." Harrove turned on the TV and saw his face on the evening news. The bold headline had flashed after he found the press secretary, so he turned it off with his hands shaking. The Judicial Council had called and demanded that he explain himself. By morning, because he knew his 30-year career was on the verge of collapse due to a 27-year-old and her tiny cross. The following morning, the D.C. Judicial Council's office was buzzing like a beehive, and the news of Karoline Leavitt and Judge Charles Hargrove had swept through Washington, compelling the council to initiate an immediate investigation. 20-year veteran investigator Linda Martinez stood in front of a long table with dozens of Hargrove's court case files spread out. Her team had been working non-stop since 6 in the morning after receiving an official complaint from the White House office that Karoline had filed last night. and we had 48 hours to report. Linda informed her staff that her voice company finds religious symbols and Hargrove in everything. While preparing for tonight's press conference at Trump's direction, Karoline sat in her White House office. She went over the courtroom tape and sent another email to his advisor saying, "I have data from X hundreds accusing Hargrove of bias and pushing this hard." Her phone was buzzing nonstop with messages from supporters, reporters, and attorneys, and one law student wrote, "You inspire me." When Karoline realized that this was not just her battle, it had reached thousands. Hargrove found my mother for a cross. Mrs. Thompson then entered the inquiry room at the courthouse, holding her little notebook. "I've been with Hargrove for 12 years, and she told Linda that although her voice was wobbly, he was resolute and always targeted religious symbols, crosses, hijabs, and anything unusual. But he ignored loud jewelry and vulgar clothing." Linda found dozens of cases as she leafed through the notepad. On September 14, 2024, a man with a cross found $300 for causing trouble. On October 20, 2024, a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf was fined $200 for being inappropriate. "I've been a baith there for 15 years, and James will show up with a handwritten statement saying, 'Harrow found people with religious symbols 3 times more than other violations.'" Linda scowled. "Thank you, James. Once a day, I counted, he struck 5 people for crosses while ignoring 3 wearing offensive shirts." Linda quickly took notes, and after her staff verified them with official documents, the data from the previous year quickly surfaced. Christians were the focus of 70% of religious symbol penalties, which averaged $250 times the fine for other dress code violations. In the meantime, Charles Hargrove sat in his home office facing the council via Zoom. I didn't mean to seem biased, but he spoke weakly while holding his head in his hands. Linda gave the data, and Mr. Hargrove's records indicate that persons who wear crosses are punished 80% harsher than those who commit identical infractions. By noon, Linda's preliminary report was finished, and she informed the council that this isn't just Hargrove. We found 3 other DC judges with similar tendencies, though milder, but Hargrove is the clearest case of bias against religion, especially Christianity. How do you explain that Hargrove fell silent, eyes downcast, and remembered Carol's steely voice and sharp reasoning about the First Amendment? I didn't realize, he mumbled. I thought I was maintaining order. Hargrove was suspended immediately by the council. News of a final decision leaking out caused X to explode once more. Cross is suspended in court. A conservative perspective made by Karoline Leavitt upsets the system. Trump's legal acumen triumphs once more. At 6:00 p.m., Karoline stood in front of the mirror in the White House briefing room, adjusting her jacket while the cross continued to shine. "I was proud of you when Trump entered," and clapped her shoulder. "I was fined yesterday for wearing a cross, not because I was wrong, but because a judge believed he was above the law," Karoline said in a voice that echoed. "I fought back not just for myself but for everyone treated unfairly for their faith." The press crowd buzzed with questions, but she calmly responded by citing the law and X data. "Tonight, we show them that religious freedom is untouchable." Hargrove watched the briefing on TV with shaking hands, turned it off, and sat in the dark. His phone was flooded with messages from colleagues and reporters, but what really shocked him was the testimony of Thompson and Wilson, people he trusted. He then opened his laptop and looked up the Church of Lukumi Babalu. He sighed when I told Karoline that he had read it. She is correct. Hargrove felt small and contacted the council voice horse saying, "I'm resigning, but I want to help fix this." The following day, Hargrove showed up at a small council meeting without his judge's robe, and I didn't notice my own bias. Instead, he stated, "My eyes are red." My eyes were opened by Karoline Leavitt, and I wish to participate in the program to ensure that my mistakes are not repeated. Linda concurred, pointing out that Hargrove's turning around would be helpful. The news went viral, igniting a debate. Some on X ridiculed Hargroves for pretending to be sincere, while others backed him, since at least he acknowledges his mistakes. Caroline received an email from Linda Hargrove in her office saying that he had resigned and agreed to train you. She smiled as she looked at the cross in the mirror, realizing that the Christian group suing the government was now only a small part of a larger story. She transformed a routine day into a catalyst for change, not only for Hargrove, but for the entire system. The climate in Washington changed significantly just 4 days after the event in the D.C. local court. The silver cross on Karoline Leavitt's navy blazer collar, which was still visible in her White House office window facing Pennsylvania Avenue, was a symbol of a movement larger than she had ever imagined. Her phone was ringing with messages from Trump conservatives and regular people thanking her for speaking out, and an email from the D.C. Judicial Council had just arrived with new regulations. Knowing that this victory wasn't hers alone, Miss Leavitt grinned when the council released new guidelines for D.C. courts following the lightning-fast probe. Linda Martinez, the lead investigator, told the council that the Hargrove case demonstrated the need for greater openness and that the first step is First Amendment training for all employees, from judges to clerks. She also said that there should be no restrictions on religious symbols unless they actually cause disruption. A new plaque that read, "Religious freedom is a right," was placed outside the courthouse. Beyond the point of violation, Caroline noticed that the hash cross in court was still trending on X. Because of Karoline Leavitt, BC has changed its laws. At the first training session, Charles Hargrove, who is no longer a judge, stood in front of hundreds of court employees and spoke in a raspy but earnest manner. I was mistaken in my belief that I was fair. There were a few nodding misses in the small throng, but Karoline Leavitt taught me to examine myself and not allow prejudice blind. Hugh Thompson, who was recently chosen to lead the court's transparency initiative, took notes while seated in the front row. James Wilson, who was in charge of court BFF training, added, "We're the eyes and ears here. If we see injustice, we speak up." Hargrove saw them, understanding that he was making reparations, which was a minor but essential step. Not only a memento, Caroline displayed the $500 fine receipt in a glass frame on the wall of her White House office as a reminder of one person's strength to speak up. At a conservative event in Virginia where thousands gathered to hear the White House's legal genius, Trump walked in and clapped her shoulder saying, "You're a star, Caroline. The religious freedom crowd loves you and so do I." He laughed heartily, his voice booming, "May we just W big." She nodded, preparing for her next speech. The incident's impact extended beyond Washington, D.C. States such as Texas, Ohio, and Florida started examining their own court regulations. "Thanks to Karoline Leavitt for reminding us about religious freedom," the governor of Texas tweeted. Texas will follow suit after a group of Florida attorneys requested such training after X-persons shared pictures of themselves with crosses in court. "No one can stop me from wearing Islamic insignia or Buddhist wristbands," with the caption, "My freedom." Caroline read these posts with pride in her heart. She hadn't anticipated that a single courtroom incident would spark this kind of movement. The following day, Caroline stood on a stage in Virginia in front of 5,000 people who were waving banners for religious freedom. She said, "I just wanted to do my job. But when a judge came across me because of my faith, I couldn't keep quiet." The audience erupted in applause, with some shouting Caroline for president. She grinned while waving camera flashes, and the image of the cross shining on her neck went viral on social media, and the media dubbed it the symbol of resiliency back in Washington. Mrs. Thompson was in charge of the revised record-keeping, which now includes a thorough account and a monthly check for bias. Young bailiffs were instructed by James Wilson to speak up without fear. It did, and so must we. One evening, Caroline got Linda Martinez's letter. She put it down and looked at the framed fine receipt, pondering on the journey from one unexpected day to this wave of reform. "You didn't just change Hargrove, you changed the system." At 9 p.m., Trump made a call. "Caroline, thank you, Mr. President, I'm ready." She sat touching the cross from a small accessory that now lit the road she walked for millions of people, not just herself. "You're my gold," he said, adding, "The opposition is panicking and we're winning. Rest up more tomorrow." She laughed. 3 months later, Karoline Leavitt stood at the White House podium, her navy blazer collar's silver cross gleaming as the camera flashed continuously. Millions of people gathered in front of her, including religious community representatives and journalists, to hear her talk about religious freedom. "We changed the system today," and the crowd clapped some people holding hash crosses in court signs outside the D.C. local court, which now has a new plaque in its lobby. 3 months ago, I just wanted to do my job when she started echoing her voice, but when a judge fined me for my faith, I stood up for all of you. Justice respects all religions. A young law student wrote her a letter. "I was afraid to fight, Miss Leavitt. But your cross case gave me the strength to open a free clinic for persons who are discriminated against because of their faith." Charles Hargrove, a volunteer instructor, stood in front of a training class and said, "I was wrong. Once I left, it taught me justice has no room for bias." Caroline thanked him as she read it in front of her mirror that evening, knowing that she had inspired the next generation. Mrs. Thompson and James Wilson continued to ensure court transparency. She nodded over the phone as Trump called her Caroline, saying, "You're my warrior. Keep it up." She felt more responsible than ever. As Caroline entered the White House balcony and looked out over Washington, D.C. at dusk, the cross she was holding wasn't only a keepsake. Rather, it was the flame she had started that was emanating from a tiny courtroom. "Freedom in America doesn't come free," she whispered. "It takes fighters." A message from the Judicial Council wanted her to lead a national reform commission, so she smiled, ready for the next challenge. One day she had changed laws, inspired others, and demonstrated that one person's belief could shake the world. The story of the judge finding Karoline Leavitt for wearing a cross only to find out she's a legal genius reflects real tensions in today's U.S. society, particularly the conflict between systemic power and individual freedom. Judge Harrow's decision about Karoline's cross reflects the way some public officials force their personal opinions on the law, a trend that Americans observe in cases involving religious symbols in public places like schools. Her counterattack, which was based on the Church of Lukumi and the First Amendment Babalu. As precedent shows, the Constitution continues to be a powerful defense of freedom against injustice. The hashtag #HashCrossInCourt, going viral on X in support of Trump, demonstrates how social media and political leadership can magnify individual voices. Caroline didn't just argue with Hargrove. She recorded cited law and rallied a network from the White House to the public. This teaches us that in modern America, where power can be misused, you need evidence like her recording to know your rights through legal arguments and harness public support. This trend is widespread in 2025 America. The lesson isn't just to stand against wrong. It's how to use knowledge, community, and technology to drive change. Hargrove's transformation from oppressor to reformer also demonstrates how communication and coercion may convert enemies into allies. Be persistent but patient, as Caroline did when she used her fine receipt as a metaphor, as one modest action today could change the system tomorrow.